Every civilization in human history has tried to answer the same terrifying questions. Why are we here? What happens after death? Why does the universe exist at all? Why do humans suffer? What is consciousness? Why is there something instead of nothing? And yet the answers change completely depending on where and when you were born. One culture says there is one God, another says there are thousands. One says reincarnation, another says eternal heaven or hell. Another says existence itself is an illusion. Some worship ancestors, some worship nature, some worship nothing at all. And despite all these contradictions, almost every religion claims certainty. Not possibility, not theory, certainty. They don't say, this may be true. They say, this is the truth. And many claim, reject it and you will suffer forever. That alone creates a disturbing philosophical problem, because if eternal punishment exists, then geography becomes one of the most important factors in determining your fate. A child born into a Christian family will most likely become Christian. A child born in Saudi Arabia will most likely become Muslim. A child born in India will likely become Hindu. A child born into an atheist household may never believe in any God at all. Most people do not arrive at belief through years of neutral investigation. They inherit it emotionally, socially, and culturally before they're old enough to critically examine it. Religion often becomes less about discovering truth and more about accepting the worldview of the tribe you were born into. And once belief becomes tied to family, identity, morality, and fear of death, questioning it can feel psychologically dangerous. Because doubting doesn't just risk being wrong. For many people, doubting risks eternal torture, rejection from family, loss of community, or the collapse of meaning itself. That fear alone can trap people inside ideas they never truly examined. But then comes the bigger question. If an all-knowing, perfectly just creator exists, why would salvation depend so heavily on birthplace, culture, historical era, or parental beliefs? Why would billions of sincere humans be condemned for believing what they were raised to believe? And when you realize there have been thousands of religions throughout human history, the certainty becomes even harder to understand. Because every religion has followers who are deeply convinced they are right. Every religion has stories, prophets, miracles, sacred texts, personal experiences, traditions passed through generations. If humans can become absolutely convinced of completely different things, how do you know which belief, if any, is truly the final answer? And then people begin looking deeper into the religions themselves and discover the history is far more complicated than they were taught. Many religious texts were not simply dropped from the sky fully assembled. They were translated, copied by hand, edited, debated, reinterpreted. And sometimes entire books were removed, rejected, or declared non-canon by religious institutions. The Book of Enoch is one of the most famous examples. Ancient Jews and early Christians were familiar with it. Parts of it are even referenced in the Bible itself. Yet, later, most branches of Christianity removed it from official scripture, while the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church still considers it sacred. That raises uncomfortable questions. Who decided which books counted as divine truth? Why were some writings accepted while others were rejected? Were those decisions purely spiritual, or were politics, power, consistency, and human institutions involved? And Enoch is not the only example. There were many ancient writings excluded from mainstream religion. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, Gnostic texts, and many others. Religious believers argue these books were excluded to protect the integrity of the faith from false teachings. But skeptics often see something else. Humans deciding which ideas survived and which disappeared. And then comes another uncomfortable question. What actually separates a religion from a cult? Because throughout history, almost every major religion began as a small group built around extraordinary claims. A man hears the voice of God. A prophet claims divine revelation. Followers gather around teachings outsiders consider irrational. The group develops rules, rituals, symbols, and moral codes. Critics call them dangerous, delusional, or heretical. At what point does a cult become a religion? Time? Population size? Political power? Social acceptance? Because from the outside looking in, many religions and cults share disturbing similarities. Absolute truth claims, charismatic leaders, fear of punishment, promises of salvation, strict moral systems, pressure to conform, and the division between believers and outsiders. One group calls itself the Chosen. Another calls itself enlightened. Another claims only they understand the truth while the rest of humanity is lost. And every group believes the others are wrong. That creates another philosophical problem. If a belief system formed today with the exact same claims as an ancient religion, many people would immediately call it a cult. But if that same belief survives for 2,000 years, gains billions of followers, builds institutions, governments, and traditions, society begins calling it a religion. So who decides where the line is? Because history shows that many groups once considered dangerous cults eventually became accepted religions. And many groups called religions today are still viewed as cults by outsiders. You also notice something strange throughout history. The closer two religions are to each other, the more violently they often seem to fight. Not always over completely different gods or completely different moral systems, but over tiny differences in interpretation. One side says the prophet was the final messenger, another disagrees. One side baptizes this way, another says that way is wrong. One believes salvation comes through faith alone, another says works matter too. And somehow those small differences have fueled wars, executions, persecution, terrorism, and hatred for centuries. In many cases, religions with almost identical foundations become bitter enemies precisely because they are so similar. Because when two groups are nearly the same, the small differences become identity itself. And once identity becomes tied to eternal truth, compromise starts feeling impossible. If both sides believe God is absolutely on their side, then disagreement no longer feels like an opinion. It feels like a battle between truth and evil. That's one reason religious conflict can become so intense. Both sides often believe they are not merely fighting for land, power, or politics, but for cosmic truth itself. And that creates another uncomfortable question. If divine truth were perfectly clear, why would humans fragment into thousands of competing interpretations, denominations, sects, and factions, many of them fighting each other despite worshiping the same God? Maybe humans are too flawed to interpret something infinite correctly, or maybe certainty itself is the dangerous part. And that leads to another question people have struggled with for thousands of years. If there is a God, why does the universe feel so silent? Because when people look around the world, they don't just see beauty, they see suffering that feels endless. Children dying of disease, wars, starvation, natural disasters, animals tearing each other apart just to survive, good people suffering, cruel people thriving, millions praying for help while the silence never breaks. And if an all-powerful creator exists, why does it so often feel like humanity has been left alone? Some people describe it as if God created the universe, set the laws in motion, and then stepped back without interfering. Almost like a parent who abandoned the house long ago, while the children keep arguing over what the parent wanted. That feeling grows stronger the more chaotic the world becomes. Because if a loving creator actively guides humanity, why is truth so unclear? Why are religions divided? Why is suffering built so deeply into life itself? Why does nature operate through death, extinction, predation, disease, and pain long before humans ever existed? It can make reality feel less like a carefully guided story and more like a system running on its own. Some religious people answer this with ideas like free will, spiritual growth, tests of faith, or the idea that humans simply cannot understand a larger divine plan. Others believe God exists, but no longer intervenes directly. Some believe humanity misunderstood God entirely, and others conclude there may be no higher being at all. But emotionally, a lot of people understand that feeling. If there is something out there, it often feels distant, silent, or impossible to fully reach. And maybe that silence is part of why humans keep creating religions in the first place, trying to fill the gap between existence and uncertainty. And maybe religion survived for another reason too. Human life used to be unbelievably brutal. For most of history, people regularly died young. Disease wiped out families. Child mortality was normal. War, famine, infection, and suffering surrounded everyday life. There were times in history where reaching adulthood itself was not guaranteed. Religion may have helped humans psychologically survive that reality. It gave people hope, meaning, community, moral structure, and the belief that suffering was not pointless. Because without some larger meaning attached to existence, despair could consume entire societies. Religion may have acted as emotional survival for humanity itself, a way to keep going despite the pain of existence. And shared beliefs may have helped civilizations grow. Shared meaning creates trust. Trust creates cooperation. Cooperation builds societies. But that creates another difficult question. Did humans create religion because it was true, or because believing in something was psychologically necessary for survival? Because something can serve a powerful purpose, and still not be objectively true. People can emotionally need an idea without the idea being factual. At the same time, others would argue the opposite, that maybe humans crave meaning because we were designed to seek something beyond ourselves, and that's the problem. Psychological usefulness does not automatically prove or disprove something, and honestly, the deeper you think about existence, the stranger reality becomes, because the universe itself almost feels impossible. The laws of physics are balanced with unbelievable precision. Gravity is stable enough for stars to form. Stars create heavier elements. Those elements become planets. Chemistry becomes biology. Biology becomes consciousness. And somehow dead matter began looking back at itself asking, why do I exist? Even science still struggles with the deepest questions. What caused the universe? Why do the laws of physics exist at all? What is consciousness? Why does reality follow mathematical order? Why is there something instead of nothing? The more some people think about it, the more it feels like reality itself may have been designed. But then they look at organized religion and find contradictions, human corruption, historical problems, moral inconsistencies, thousands of competing truth claims, and doctrines that often seem shaped by the time period they came from. So they end up caught between two feelings. The universe feels too precise to be meaningless, but human explanations feel too flawed to fully trust. Maybe there is a creator. Maybe there's some deeper reality humans barely comprehend. Maybe all religions contain fragments of humanity reaching towards something greater without fully grasping it. Or maybe humans are simply pattern-seeking creatures trying to force meaning onto a universe we don't yet understand. Nobody truly knows. And perhaps the wisest position isn't blind belief or blind rejection, but the willingness to keep questioning.